I want to welcome everyone to the call today. Dr. Lemberger Truelove is just having a little bit of technical difficulty, but he should be on momentarily. So we appreciate your patience and look forward to answering your questions. I know there were a few people that did email us some questions ahead of time at jcd.un or at unt.edu. If you have questions that come up during this call, please don't hesitate to email them in the group chat, and we'll try and get to all your questions.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Or just a thumbs up because I think that there's like 25 people on the call. Perfect. Thanks. Well, welcome. My name is Matthew Limburger Truelove, and as many of you know, I'm the editor of the Journal of Counseling and Development, and I greatly appreciate each of you joining us virtually. This is something that I wanted to do independent of the current situation that's making the world wobble, but I think it's the delivery seems a little bit more par for the course. I wasn't anticipating my internet not necessarily working, so I kind of offer that as a preface that now I've put my iPad on a hotspot. So if I go in and out, some of my editorial assistants are also hosts for this meeting. So just hang on, and I'll just get back on as soon as I possibly can. So well, again, thank you all for attending. I really want to maximize our time. But as I was thinking about this morning, I was thinking about how this is both kind of utilitarian in the sense that many of you want questions answered about how to be successful in the various roles, whether it be as an author or possibly being a review board member. And I've received a number of questions that I definitely want to spend our time handling those. But I also want to spend a little bit of time um, in this virtual format just to talk about the importance of solidarity amongst our profession, especially in these kind of precarious and inauspicious times. Um, Looking right now, I'm just getting updates from my editorial assistants that there's 45 people on now simultaneously, which is incredibly heartening and encouraging to me that this many people are interested in the work that we do. Um, and I don't know how this will play out because I've never, this is like a 45-person group session, but But maybe if everyone can pull off mute for just a few seconds and simultaneously just say hello, because it's our way of kind of collapsing some of the social distancing, the appropriate social distancing, just so that we can kind of honor each other.
Hello.
So,
Hello.
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 Hi.
Hello.
Hey everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, when I first thought about it, I was like, oh, use some good group skills and let everyone have an opportunity to introduce themselves and where they're from. And that, would basically constitute our entire time together. So as much as I would like to do that, it just probably isn't the most feasible. To give a little bit of an outline for our itinerary, so I think I've received 14 questions in advance. And so I'm going to handle those first. Many of them are somewhat similar, so I don't know if we're necessarily going to have to go through each one of them with the same intimacy. This being said, what I've asked my editorial assistants, who is Mia and Lindsay, and so you probably see their names many times, and I also want to start off by saying how incredibly grateful I am to them for their hard work and staying in contact with each one of you all and keeping me, rightly ordered, because without them, my 50,000 foot perspective would oftentimes get very lost. So I greatly appreciate them. But what they'll do is, I do encourage any spontaneous questions, particularly follow-up questions, but because there's so many people and people coming in and off, it might be helpful to use the chat function within Zoom to chat messages to them. And then what I'm going to have them do is, so that I don't have to oscillate from screen to screen, I'm going to have them text me those. So they're just kind of in a central place. And so I just don't get lost trying to, weed through the various texts. Does that follow? All right, cool. So I see some folks head shaking. All right. So just kind of briefly as a start, I want to talk a little bit about some of the, let's see if I open my response documents. Where's it at? Oops. This is always a time whenever you want things to work perfectly is when technology is not cooperating. All right. So the first question that I received, it's kind of a question that we oftentimes get, and I love answering this in email, but it's really a nice opportunity to be able to talk through this in as much of a dialogical way as is possible. So if you require additional clarification, please don't hesitate to pull yourself off of mute and ask for some clarity, because this, again, is a question I get quite often. And that is just generally, what is JCD looking for? In this, in particular, asked in 2020, what types of articles focused on what themes, emerging concepts, piquing the interest of people. And not to be too trite and just simply to go to the scope of JCD, but what I find is that that there's oftentimes a lot of confusion with just the way that the words are written out in our scope for would-be authors. Really, our primary focus is to be the flagship journal for counseling practice and outcome pieces related to the work that professional counselors do. And I look back to Jane Meyer's seminal piece on, what are the primary axioms of counseling that certainly are related to our allied professions, but that make us distinct, which includes preventative work, focus on wellness, focus on development. Later, authors started to add to this, to that cadre of qualities of counseling and the social justice content. But embedded within that is really this idea that, JCD, as different than some of our other journals in ACA that we're affiliated with, we're really focusing on process and outcomes. And so one of the conversations I've had with the two preceding editors is, because we do get a number of counselor education pieces. Certainly those are permissible, but that's not our primary focus. That would be counselor ed and supervision. But there are times when a counselor ed and supervision piece does have applicability to our broader readership, which are counseling practitioners and the scholars who inform counseling practitioners. And so the quick answer that I have is the more process and outcome pieces that get submitted, the better for our profession, but they're also more likely to be successful. D. Ray in 2010, I cite this quite often, less than 6% of all of our published works in the 10-year preceding her analysis were outcome pieces. And yet our entire profession is a prevention and intervention service delivery profession. And so given that 6% of our literature really pertains to that, is quite dubious. Now, I also get why it's 6%. It's hard to do, right? It's expensive. There's even though I do not hold on to that publication bias that things have to work, that there have to be positive outcomes, and that kind of Pollyannish way of accepting manuscripts is really problematic because one, it tilts in a kind of erroneous way what we think we're doing and what we think works. But then also, in terms of looking at like meta-analyses, and it's really kind of a doubtful thing. So really, for would-be authors, if I would have to suggest how you would be most successful, a high quality counseling process or outcome manuscript, I'm always looking for. That's not to say that we're not looking for high quality cross-sectional research, descriptive research. Assessment pieces are always something that people deeply value. Kind of cutting edge theory. I don't know if we'll have enough time, but I definitely would like to have a subsequent conversation, if we're not able to, what's the difference between a conceptual piece and a theoretical piece. They certainly are related, but there is some nuance that differentiates the two. Richard Watts did a great piece, I think it was 2010, in the special issue on successful publications in JCD. It talks about effective conceptual pieces, but I think also philosophic and theoretical pieces that use very effective and coherent intuitions is also something that we don't get a lot of, but that would be something that would be really desirable. So that's the things that just come off the top of my mind. Again, just high quality pieces are high quality pieces. I do like to be shocked. There are times when, submissions will be received, and then I, kind of read over the abstract, do the initial read, and it's maybe a topic that I didn't think, we would receive, and that I learned a lot, and those also are types of pieces. But my general approach is this going to serve the greatest number of people in the greatest number of ways? It really is kind of a ideological diversity. And so good quality pieces that can serve the greatest number of people is kind of the most successful way. And I know that sounds kind of almost ubiquitous across all journals, but as the flagship journal that represents 18 specialty areas and tens of hundreds of thousands of professional counselors, and also which obviously we serve our audience, our ACA related audience, first and foremost. When people search for journal articles, they're searching broadly across disciplines, and I do want our work to be relevant to cross discipline as well, which gets to the second question about impact factor. But before I move on, are there any questions or thoughts about my response to what we're looking for? Nope, we're good. Okay. So the other is a little bit more, the next question is a little bit more kind of the facts, but I'm going to add on some additional content. It's a three-part question. What is our current acceptance rate, impact factor, and review time? So for the last couple of years, just generally speaking, it's about 10%. More precisely, this year was 12.5%. And then the year before that was 11.6. The numbers of submissions were a little down, but not a lot. So that raised the acceptance rate up just a bit. But generally speaking, about 10% is what you can count on of new submissions. I don't like, as an editor, I think it's very impolitic to offer a revise and resubmit to an author if I don't think it's not guaranteed for it to be published eventually, but that it's most likely. It's just not kind and compassionate to authors, especially at the highest stakes in their career when they need to publish. I mean, my general philosophy about review, and one of the reasons why, so I formerly was the editor of the Humanistic Journal, and I loved that journal, truly did. But why then did I pivot to JCD was that when things didn't get accepted in JHC, they typically just didn't go anywhere else. Whereas with JCD, I really believe that if we do a good job of not just evaluating and assessing the quality, which can be very, hegemonic and top down and feelings of judgment, but instead if we can be constructive and helpful, that even those 90% that don't get accepted, many of which really are high quality pieces, that when they submit elsewhere, because they more likely will do so coming from JCD, that we will still have affected the literature. And so I take deep pride in, not just working with the authors and showing here's the things that worked and here's some things that it's not so much that it's wrong, here's just a different way of looking at it based upon this small sample of readers that represent our profession. And it kind of untethers some of that personal biases and kind of proclivities we have, but then it also is more helpful and strength focused in terms of how do you get this published in the next place. And again, it's not, this kind of like indictment that, just simply because we read it this way means that everyone else henceforth will read it this way, but instead that, again, we're just a sample and here's some things you might want to consider. And so, yeah, so for me, JCD is an opportunity to touch the larger audience, just knowing that if we have more than 300 submissions a year, which we easily do that, we generally have between 300 and 400, that, just doing the math of 10% acceptance rate, I mean, there are many hundred that just will not be accepted. And again, that are just high quality pieces. And I also know that from an author's vantage point, you don't get that N of 300, you get the N of 1, right? That one thing you submitted was so important to you and is your life's work. And, I want to, while not being Pollyannish, I want to be helpful so that when it does get published somewhere else, that spirit of dialogue and that spirit of helpfulness was present, even if it's uncredited from its initial submission to JCD. The next question about impact factor, we're trending upward. So in 2017, it was a 1.2. 2018, it was a 1.3, and now this past year was a 1.4. This is all, I can't take credit for this. This is, the impact factor is a 2-year cycle. This was all the work of my predecessor, Rick Balkin, who really made a deep effort in improving the impact factor. Hopefully we continue to trend up. I do want to offer an editorial, play on words intended, aside about that. We are kind of hamstrung as a profession with impact factor for a couple of reasons. And so what I pulled was the Thompson. There's actually other impact factors, Scamajo, Google Scholar, some of which lend better to counseling. Thompson, which is the one most used and ones that universities generally most use for the purposes of tenure and promotion, does not service counseling well for a variety of reasons. One of which is that our work, for better or worse, tends to be not picked up as in the multidisciplinary journals as much as others, just because our work is so specialized and it is tailored to our work. But that's a secondary reason. The primary reason is the paucity of number of journals that we have. When you do the math on this, it's how you get an impact factor in Thompson is the number of citations divided by essentially the number of published pieces in that journal, right? But there's that 2-year window. And so within that 2-year window, and really the front end of that 2-year window gets the most inclusivity. So if you think about a typical journal in ACA, it takes about a year from things to go from submission to acceptance, and then possibly another 3 or 4 months to get into publication. There's a tiny, tiny window to fit within that time that article has to be cited and then published to be cited in the other journal. Does that make sense? So in other words, there's a downstream, there's a kind of, reflexivity between the article that's being cited and the journal that is citing it. And for disciplines that have many more journals and many more articles per issue and many more issues, that advantages them independent of even the quality of the work, right? And this is one of the many reasons why impact factor is not really a great metric, but it's the metric that a lot of folks use. There's other ways that people game the system. So if you have an online first system, and we've been asked about this before, why does ACA not use an online first? And that is when articles are accepted, they go directly to online print within a smaller window before they actually go to in press. And I'm at first I had similar questions, and then listening to the great folks who are just also terribly incredible. I can't thank the people at ACA Publication enough for the work that they do. But as different than a lot of other professional organizations or publication entities, Wiley being ours, our relationship with Wiley is that the copy editing is done in-house. And because of that, there's additional time in when it goes through our copy editors to when it ultimately gets published. And there's no reason to end that, because our copy editors are so good and they pick up so much detail. And so we might lose a little bit in terms of, a few months for something to be online first and therefore more citable, but what we gain in terms of the quality of our work far advances that. And so that's just, I think, a very wise decision. The question about review time kind of alluded to this. So I make a commitment that it's no more than 90 days, very rarely. I mean, there has to be some outstanding circumstances that doesn't occur. And this means that, and there's lots of like downstream implications. So the initial submission, it has to be populated to our reviewers within, a few days, and that's where the editorial assistants occur. I mean, their work comes in. Then it goes to the reviewers, who have approximately 30 days, the associate editors, who do a review, not just of the manuscript, but then also they look at those two reviews and try to synthesize that in a way and fill in some of the gaps. And then I actually do the same thing. Many editors will just take what the associate editors say. Now, there are occasions when the reviewers and associate editors are so thorough, like I have nothing else to say and I just don't want to be that redundant. And so I might offer a few words of encouragement, but I won't put much detail. But sometimes, as folks who've been on the review board will attest, I'll multiple page reviews myself just to fill in some gaps and offer some encouragement. So all of that just takes time. And each one of those steps is about 30-ish days. Like good airline pilots, sometimes we make up time in the air, like the reviewers will be, 20 days, and the AEs might be 15 days, and so you might get a review back in like 50 or 60 days. But generally, I would say 70 to 90 days is pretty much the typical process, which if you look at a lot of journals, especially flagship journals, that's actually pretty quick. All right, so the process thereafter is generally, we don't have a lot of grease on the wheel in terms of number of accepted manuscripts. I just don't think it's a good practice of keeping authors in the accepted in-press queue for too long. So generally from submission to publication is generally about 14 months, 11 to 14 months. So it's relatively quick. I think, look at my notes if there's any other things that I want to do here. So it wasn't asked, but just so that folks might ask this later, the typical number of revisions for an accepted manuscript, it greatly varies. Sometimes it's one. We've not, under my tenure, accepted something right out of the initial submission. Most of which have had, I would say, 2 to 3 revisions, no more than 5. And really the substantive ones are usually 2 or 3. And if once you get up into that 4 or 5, it's just your headings are a little off, and it's really more, kind of superficial, trivial type of things. that was a lot of information. Any questions or thoughts about our process? Is this helpful so far? Okay. All right. So my next question is, would JCD consider publishing more frequently to accommodate more researchers? So this is kind of embedded within this, as I see two questions. One of which is more articles per issue. I think folks think that because now we've moved into online, that mostly you can still get paper copies, I believe, or at least they send me 10 every issue. And the is that, as I mentioned before, with the copy editing and typesetting, there's still a lot of work behind the scenes that really kind of delimits just us having this like endless amount of accepted manuscripts. So that's part of it. The other thing is though, I don't like rejecting manuscripts. It's one of the more difficult things I do. Some of them really in particular that I still kind of like, I wouldn't say they haunt me. They don't keep me up at night, but there's some I still think about. And it's like the ones that got away, that I would have loved to have accepted under different conditions or those types of things. But I think for quality control, our number is pretty nice. And also knowing just how often people read and download things, there seems to be, we're in a good sweet spot now. But I think a lot of that is just management. Again, the numbers of things that can be reviewed in a timely manner through the multiple revision process. I think it would be untenable. Like we wouldn't have the same quality if we accepted more, not even because of the things that were submitted, just how we can handle it throughout the review process. Also the number of issues, there's an economics behind this that is at the ACA level that I completely endorse that perspective. But again, I just think that what we do now really is kind of at our edge of what is probably reasonable in terms of management. So do we consider it? Sure. I mean, we have those conversations all the time. Like what is the numbers of pages of an issue, and what types of costs and go into these things, but I don't think that there's anything urgent that would change that. Okay. So this one's very specific about a particular type of methodology, but I want to try to open it up as well. The next question was, I was wondering about submitting research using innovative research methodologies, which, okay, so I'm going to partition that off for a moment. I think is great. I really do think that sophistication and yet elegance is what we should be trying to approach in our counseling. And what I mean by that is that as we know new ways of apprehending data, we certainly should want to utilize those technologies. But it still has to be elegant. And that means that it has to be packaged in such a way that people within the communities that establish these methodologies understand. Now, I'm guessing that most of the people who are on this call probably are familiar with what's going on in the allied professions over the last 5 years, what's called the replication crisis, or also called the generalization crisis. That is that many of the seminal pieces, particularly in developmental psychology, but across a number of different disciplines, unable to replicate some of the really seminal findings. There was a great piece that I share with a lot of my, fellow, scholarly geeks within the counseling profession about maybe it's not a replication crisis, it's a generalization crisis. I actually think the replication crisis was in good favor for us because it illustrated the difference between doing clinical research versus doing applied in the field research. And the idiosyncrasy of every single study. I mean, it's certainly we want to shoot for generalizability, but is that really feasible when our clients are different and every instrument is different and every circumstance is different? And so I think what it makes us do is it makes us rethink some of our assumptions. But yet still I can be an apologist for that, in that scholars have worked very diligently on trying to refine our methodologies in such a way that the communities can agree that there's either reliability, validity to those approaches, trustworthiness, or at least coherence. And so the quick answer is yes, I do want the more innovative approaches to be considered within JCD. And yet to do so, it has to be something that is largely coherent with established communities of agreement within research communities, right? Again, understanding that there is going to be challenges to that, as the replication crisis has kind of exposed, and yet there's a coherence, there's a shared language. And so that's how I'd want to generally respond to that. The more specific part was the individual had asked about using a type of methodology that would require more figures, in this case, particularly photographs. And so would we be more inclusive to like a larger, kind of foregoing the typical 30 pages. And so this applies not only to kind of nascent and emergent methodologies. I think it's a general question about how much of a stickler are we to that 30 pages? Because like I could get a really great manuscript that is like 40 pages, but that has downstream effects. I have to look at both that individual manuscript, but then I also have to look at the gestalt. I have to see, does this mean I accept one fewer manuscript that might be, a really great piece, or that might, be someone who's, going up for tenure, and, this, an accepted piece in JCD, that they were that. I took 9 because I took a longer one versus 10, and that has dramatic implications. So I'm constantly ruminating on things like the systemic implications of such decisions. And so I'm pretty hesitant upon initial submissions to take longer than 30 pages, because I know in the revision process, you're generally going to have to add more than cut. And there's a great quote from the philosopher Pascal: "Sorry, I would have made it shorter had I more time." I think it's actually harder to be parsimonious and succinct, and yet we should work towards that. The reality is that when you're being asked to do new things and revise things, oftentimes it just adds to that. And so if your initial submission is already over 30 pages, it does potentially compromise just not your submission, but also other submissions. And so I'm very cautious about saying yes to that question. There are exceptions though. And this is where, we get in trouble, right? And, I try to, like a good Kantian, have a categorical imperative, like universal ethics. It's like, treat everyone as much as you can in similar ways. And yet occasionally there will be a seminal piece, or something that really challenges the field, and I might make concessions. There are some methodologies that just is really like, meta-analyses, or, another emerging methodology, at least in our field, excuse me. I would love to see more multi-level modeling pieces, longitudinal effects, individuals nested within groups, nested within time. It's really hard to do. And it takes a lot of detail to describe the construction of those models, right? And yet, because they're typically valued because of the complexity of what you're able to look for in those models, I might make an executive decision, if the rest of the piece is high quality, to look, to be a little bit more flexible with the pages. But again, I'm very cautious to say that as a general rule, because it just has multiple implications that kind of reverberate out across all the various submissions. And I try to be as fair as possible. Does that make sense? Okay. Is this pace going okay? Is this helpful, informative? Okay. All right, so the next question that I have, are there any, this kind of relates to the first one, but I think there's a sense of like, how contemporary things are. So like someone asked about, are there topics that folks should focus on now? So for example, like telemental health, emotional response. I mean, obviously timely issues are important, and to capture what we're all experiencing would privilege a piece, kind of. It still really is about quality, right? So if there's high quality pieces, JCD is not the place for a literature review, for example. And, but you can challenge the literature with a critical explication of certain themes. But really, we're trying to give a place for where the best scholarship and ideas can have, go to our greatest number of readers, because most, professional counselors are affiliated with ACA will get JCD and hopefully read JCD. Timely issues, timely articles are important, but really it's about quality. I think that really don't have too much else to say about that. The next one is, if writing a qualitative manuscript, what are some of the reasons why people often get rejected? I'm actually going to answer this across multiple different research traditions, but I'll try to tailor a little bit to qualitative to answer this person's question. I get a number of submissions, and this was true of my predecessors, because we've talked about it, that are potentially informative of counseling, but really the only thing that they have to do with counseling is the fact that they were written by counselor educators. And, and so then what ends up happening is, because you're required to have an implications for practice section, there will be discussion points that are proffered that are completely divorced of what you actually studied. And we're not the only journal that does this. I try to stay abreast of multiple literatures, and you see this even more so in some of our, and I won't call out particular journals that I see this most recurrent, but if you can proffer an outcome without the data, then what was the point of doing the study, right? And so I won't reject it just for that, but if that's the preponderance of your discussion section, that makes it hard to accept a manuscript. And I would say that the greatest number of rejected pieces, outside of they just don't fit the scope of JCD, is that even when the high quality pieces are put together, it's either impossible given the research questions, and it's not to say it wasn't a high quality piece, it just doesn't fit JCD, or the research questions were discussed in such a way that is truly tangential from the author's method or results. And I cannot impress this point enough. Really, of the 300 to 400 submissions we get a year, this is more than 100 of them right off the bat. And and the reviewers pick it up quite quickly. And so I would just tell people, if you're going to submit to us so that you get good feedback, and that's your motivation, that's fine. But really, it should have clear pertinence to counseling, process or outcomes. And there should be a nice line tethered between the theoretical assumptions of your study leading to your methodology, leading to your analysis plan, how you present your results, and then how you describe it in your discussion. Is that helpful? Any questions or thought about that? And again, I know it probably sounds intuitively reasonable, but unless I showed you 20 examples, I can't really illustrate just how much that is a typical type of manuscript that we have that is not going to be successful in JCD. All right, so let me move on down to the next one. Actually, no, we go back. So with qualitative, I don't think that there's an additional challenge. I would love, earlier I talked about the types of pieces I would want. Where does qualitative fit into there? Qualitative, I wish I saw more submissions. What is the actual process of counseling? What are clients experiencing? Outcome studies obviously are very prized, and there's some dilemmas, that in qualitative research, even though there are some, earlier we talked about emergent research traditions. I've started to read a little bit more in recent months about longitudinal qualitative design, and I'm still trying to wrap my mind around that, the epistemology of that. And yet, again, there's a community of agreement that seems to value that, and so I want to appreciate these emerging traditions. But what I don't see a lot of that I think would be really helpful to our readers is, what is the experience of being a client? What is the experience of being a counselor? And I do think that qualitative can respond to that in a way that quantitative work would struggle, because oftentimes I hear that, it's easy to write a quantitative piece about client processes and outcomes. Well, one, that's not terribly true, but I do get that many qualitative researchers might feel like they're on the outside of that, and I don't think that that's true, because process related pieces and perceptions of outcome related pieces do fit within the wheelhouse of qualitative research, and we just don't get a lot of them. And the ones that we do are not terribly well done always. I would also encourage people to look at, again, pulling back from that 2010 piece, special issue on high quality submissions that will more likely be successful, the qualitative piece that Danica Hayes put together. What we do also get a lot of, and this is something that I see more of in the counseling literature versus other literatures, and the one time, where there's no prolonged engagement, there's no, like thick description of the data, and by prolonged engagement, the one 20-minute interview over the phone with 10 people, there are other ways to collect data to make certain that you are apprehending the phenomenon that I would suggest, right? And different ways to triangulate the data so that there's more depth of inquiry. And that's not to say that those studies are not sometimes helpful. It's just, it's really difficult to take much credence in such brevity and such sparse data, right? It's almost an analog to an insufficient sample size in quantitative research. All right. This person has a similar question. What makes qualitative manuscripts stronger? I actually think I described some, just good, thick, deep data. Like when I was taught qualitative research, it's yes, there's the aesthetic matters, like how you present your work matters, but the data really matters. And I think the same is true in quantitative, right? You want to take credence in was this the best measure? Did you have a sufficient sample size, so on and so forth? And did you look at the constructs in appropriate ways? I think it's especially true in qualitative research. Like if you, for example, from a phenomenological tradition, if you're looking at the lived experiences of participants, did you really apprehend their lived experiences, or was it, like the Dunning-Kruger effect is always possible, right? Dunning-Kruger effect is individuals who are low skilled in an area tend to overestimate their skill, and individuals who are low skilled high skilled individuals tend to underestimate their skills. So, that's always possible when it's collecting, certain type of data or observing certain type of phenomenon. But the more data that you have, the more sophisticated, the more dimensional it is probably a better word than sophisticated. Those will generally be more successful. I talked about the next question is why things typically get rejected. The biggest reason is, does it fit the scope within JCD? Appropriateness of methodology is definitely another one. Written quality is another. And again, for me, one of my big agenda items as a editor for JCD is more counseling process and outcome pieces. And then if you're describing implications for practice, was that again consistent with your actual study design? So, okay, it's good because the next question actually asked about that. So what does make something counseling focused? The most apparent, obviously, is if you're doing a study on clients' experiences or counselors' experiences, right? I think the best way for me to approach this question, unless you're doing an assessment piece, and that oftentimes the manuscripts that we receive that are really not closely tied to counseling are looking at certain phenomena either as qualitatively or quantitatively, and the quantitative typically is some type of cross-sectional design where like you're looking at, just give a make-believe example here, like, adolescents' self-regulatory capacities as it pertains to the number of hours online, right? Obviously there's the literature says that there's an obvious relationship between those. There is some implications for counseling. A counselor can say, work with the adolescent on some of their viewing behaviors, work with the family members and setting, structure around how much technology, how much, blue screen they get, so on and so forth. But they didn't really study that, right? They just studied the phenomenon, the occurrence. And so how do we really know that a counselor making such suggestions is actually effective in counseling? In fact, it might actually be not helpful. It might be diametrically the opposite because it's very instructive as opposed to building relationship and rapport, which we know from like the common factors literature is the most important thing. Like if you curate certain internal skills, you have a tendency of having generative and robust outcomes across a variety of areas. So we're making this kind of conjectural claim that had nothing to do with your study that I see has incredibly problematic implications, because then the next person who's going to cite that say, well, there's this empirical study that says you should do this in your counseling intervention. That study had no basis of saying that. And now there's a term in philosophy, reification. We've reified a truth claim that's not true, right? And worse yet, we've substantiated it, or we've said that we've substantiated it with evidence, but we in fact have not. Does that make sense? And that is probably going to be the most controversial idea I talk about today. And yet it is something, for as long as I'm an editor, I am going to hold very steadfast to that. I just think that the implications are too dramatic. Like, we have training competencies, we have supervision practices, we have training practices, all based upon essentially speculative, intuitive associations from descriptive cross-sectional research that is not necessarily true. And that just, it's something as a profession I do believe we need to get better at. Thoughts or questions?
Dr. Lemberger Truelove, there was a follow-up question specifically related to school counseling. And the question is posed, is JCD a potential home for content that is relevant to school counselors, counselor educators, and professional organizations?
All right, yeah. So I hope that no one in here is, labored through anything that I write. But for anyone who's familiar with my writing, I'm a former school counselor, love school counseling, written about school counseling throughout my entire life. So I'm team school counseling. Put a hashtag there. But it's not that I necessarily will privilege school counseling pieces over any others. But, one of the nice things about school counseling pieces is, for me, and this, one of the nice things about school counseling is that earlier I alluded to Jane Meyer's kind of the fundamental tenets of counseling. I think in school counseling, you're always going to be preventative. You're always going to be developmentally focused. You're always going to be wellness focused. So I think it does lend very well for the philosophic coherence. So the quick answer is yes. JCD does fit for school counseling. This being said, as I said before, it has to have pretty broad relevance. And so even the school counseling pieces, I don't want you to overextend your results, as I just suggested before, but it is important so that our colleagues in clinical mental health counseling or career counseling see how this work can pertain broadly, not only because many of these people will be other, be our compatriots who work in schools as well, or work with people who have children in school. It's just, if you're doing good work, there should be some broad relevance, right? Will be ones that typically get more accepted. I hope that answered the question. The counselor educator one is a little bit more challenging, only because, and Rick Balkin, the past editor, I don't think he'll mind me quoting him. He might be on the line. I don't know, but he said he didn't want JCD to become Counselor Ed and Supervision, that journal, the great Counselor Ed and Supervision journal, but didn't want JCD to be CES light, right? Because that could easily be the case. So yes, I will accept pieces that are counselor education and supervision focused. During my tenure, there's been some that have already hit press to illustrate that. But I do think that there will be an additional burden. Like they really have to be, you have to show how they're relevant, not only to counselor education and supervision, but how they're relevant to the boots on the ground people. Like how scholars who are working with practitioners and how practitioners who are working with clients can take this information. So the straight, here's what I taught in my class piece probably doesn't fit JCD. But here's what I taught in my class and here's how my students improved as counselors, that does. Does that make sense? So, I mean, very related, but a little bit more intentionality in terms of how this trickles down to professional counselors. Yeah, was that all three of them? I know there were three different types that you said: school counselors, counselor educators, and then there was a third, I think.
Professional organizations.
Professional organizations. Yeah, I mean, so, and I interpret that as like leadership and advocacy. Yes, I do think that we can have a spot for that. If we generally accept 9 or 10 per issue, the greater majority, anticipate generally 6 or 7 are going to be empirical pieces of some sort, quantitative or qualitative. But leadership pieces, we do have a great journal in ACA related to leadership and advocacy, and so that's probably the best fit. But again, seminal ones that affect the entire profession, yeah, it should go in JCD. Let me see. I've got a few more here for folks, and I know we're working on an hour already, and I'm like halfway through the questions, and so feel free to hop off if you need. But I'm going to stick around for as long as people stay on. So, so what are some of the other journals that I would recommend? Oh man, so this is going to get me in trouble. But for those that know me well, know that I don't really care about that. Obviously, I think that if you are in our profession, we should look to our ACA affiliated journals first. And I do think that we should try to, I get that impact factor matters, but it doesn't. And we really should look towards the best fit and the scope first. And so, my answer to this would be so idiosyncratic that I probably am not going to get in trouble because I can't give a specific answer because every different submission will have a different answer. On the other hand, I don't want to discourage people from looking multidisciplinary. I mean, there are some great, in my own career, I have looked towards journals outside of counseling because I've wanted our allied professions to say, counselors are doing good work too, right? And I don't want us to navel gaze so much. And also, I think that as our work gets looked at in other disciplines of relevance, that does nothing but raise the tides for our own journals because they're more likely to get cited and those types of things. So I think there was a special issue last year, I believe, and one of the strongest psychotherapy related journals. Well, it's called Psychotherapy. That Paul Peluso had a piece in it. It was the only counselor educator in that special issue, and I think the special issue was on meta-analyses of certain types of counseling outcomes, and and I thought, wow, it's great that Paul was in that, and yet I wish that there's many of our scholars that I know who could have had their work in that really incredible issue. So, yeah, I can't give specific answers to every different type of publication, but just generally, do look to our journals first. When you do look to our journals, cite our journals as well. It does matter. I mean, don't do it kind of I'm not suggesting that we be opportunistic to try to, artificially inflate an impact factor. And yet, if our literature is if our literature is important, then we should be citing it. So, has editors considered allowing people to submit more than one place at a time? And what reason is that not allowed? Some journals take months to respond. The acceptance rate is 10% or less. However, there are thousands more researchers publishing now. It's true. Yeah, more people are trying to publish, and there are, similar or less opportunities in some ways. And yet, I mean, this is an APA ethics thing, right? You submit to one place at a time. And there's a lot of things I could say to this. So the quickest answer, the most direct answer is, I mean, that's just an ethics, and to explain the ethics, one just, if you think about this kind of intuitively, if you're submitting one place and then you have journal reviewers and editors in their process reviewing, doing work, and then it gets accepted somewhere else and you pull it out, you've essentially taken their autonomy from them, right? And that's just, that's a basic axiom of counseling. So for that reason, no, I would never consider going afield from the APA ethics in that regard. And though, yeah, I do get, and so like my response to that is, we just have to be more efficient and maintain our quick timeline of getting things through. Any advice for doctoral students seeking mentorship? I'm actually going to expand this across our entire profession, but especially our doctoral students. In our profession, I get why we don't think in terms of labs the way that some of our allied disciplines do, because we just don't typically have the same resources in colleges of education, and many of the counselor education programs are not necessarily in R1, so there certainly are some exceptions. And so it's a challenge to not just perform research, but to have systematic research over time, where you've got students coming in and working with them in a developmentally appropriate level. So like at the beginning, you're just having them shadow more advanced doctoral students. These are the types of things that, like psychology and sociology, it's pretty much standard practice. And there's, again, a variety of reasons why we don't do this. But I think that even if we have some things that might prohibit that, thinking that way and acting that way would benefit us. One, because you're more likely to interface with people, those kind of organic, spontaneous ideas that come through dialogue. But then also just maximizing the number of publications. I mean, if you look in, again, our allied professions, they'll have 15 people on a publication. And so, and it's because each of those 15 people are leading 15 different respective projects, and they're having one small bit of contribution to another. So you're learning, it's edifying, while simultaneously maximizing your resources. So I think that's one of the things I would think about, is finding a community of kindred scholars. One who can challenge your ideas, can help refine, you can talk through methodology. I think that's important. But then again, just some of the pragmatics of it, just working smarter and not harder. Right? This is definitely a time of diminishing resources. So those types of communities, I think, are incredibly helpful. Relative to, like, another kind of just general is, while it might not be possible to get onto JCD as a reviewer, in fact, it pretty much isn't as a doctoral student, I have learned to be a better author, I believe, by being a reviewer and editor. And so if there's a specialty area that you're really into, and that's your heart place, there's probably a division for it. And that division has a journal, and that division is looking for reviewers. And when you do review, don't just mail it in. I get that everyone's busy, but the 2 or 3 sentence thing doesn't help the authors, but honestly, it doesn't help the reviewer either. Because this is that kind of process of like, I'm looking through articles and I'm thinking, not just, how can I help this author, but also, like, if I were writing this thing, what things would I need to think through? It's again, like thinking through counterfactuals. And when you think through counterfactuals, you're always looking at just the great diversity of alternatives, and it changes the way you think about scholarship, and it changes the way you think about who's reading your work. And so I think, my direct suggestion would be, become a reviewer, even if it's ad hoc. at the level that is your threshold. Like if you can't do any more than what you've already got going on, it's better to do them better than more. But do as many as you can, because for me, being systematic and intentional in my review and all those various roles, whether again it was as a reviewer, as an associate editor, as an editor, has just helped my writing. And also I got to look for trends, like what things do people look for in terms of successful articles. What are other reviewers saying? What did I miss? I mean, to this day, like I'm always so humbled by our review board members. So because there's things that in my initial read, I just, sometimes I'm a little embarrassed. I'm like, man, how did I miss that? But yet you start to pick those things up over time. What last question that I have here, and then I'll have to go to some of the chat ones, and then maybe any ones that folks have been sitting on for a while. Is there a limit to the number of manuscripts an editor would consider from the same author at the same time? Absolutely not. Like, you can inundate us with, with things, right? It's perfectly fine. All is welcome. But that's also, I want to look at the kind of counterfactual of that. Like, I don't look at it and say, well, because this is an author who's published consistently, that they're going to get more likely accepted. Again, for those equity and fairness things that I talked about before. So submit multiple things. We've got a few authors who, and everyone knows their names, who, do get successful pieces. And it's not hubris. It's just they're doing the work. And so if you're doing the work, get it to the biggest audience, and JCD is the biggest audience. Lindsay and Mia, were there any questions that were coming in that I missed?
Yes. One of the questions that came through are, what criteria do you look for in a replication study?
Oh, yeah, this is that answer that you always give your students in counselor ed that is never terribly satisfactory. It depends. Like, first of all, the paucity of replication studies is a problem in our profession and in so many academic disciplines. So in general, I encourage, in fact, I don't think in my almost 2 years as being editor, we've seen a single replication study submitted. And if so, I must have missed where they said that. So that's indicative of how my response is going to come forth. But if we had, I would look at, man, I say this cautiously, because on the one hand, I think that every study should be replicated. Like, just assuming truth from one set of conditions, regardless of your effect size, is just, it's, again, the replication crisis. If it's taught us anything, that context matters, circumstance matters. And so any type of replication study should be valued as much or more so than even a new submission, because it's challenging the existing literature. Even if it completely coheres, the findings are identical, it still challenges it. So this being said, if we had a surplus of those things, I would probably look at, in much the same way that I would any other new submission or kind of nascent area, is like, when the new issue comes out, are there going to be a great number of people who read this or just skip on to the next one because it's well-tilled soil? And but again, like, I'm really cautious in saying that, because I just don't think that we do enough replication, and I can't think of an occasion when even doing the same study 10 times is not going to bear new fruit. Were there any others that came through chat? Because I want to put those first. And
Would there be an interest in research study describing counseling service on a national level?
If I get the question, yeah, I mean, so maybe the person who asked this question can help clarify, but if it's referring to like, yeah, I'm trying to think of maybe if I'm interpreting this correctly, but like large national issues, I guess I would need some help understanding the question because I don't know if I completely follow. So if anyone's there who put that through. No. Mia, were there any others?
Needed to unmute myself. There's one other question that you kind of alluded to, but someone was asking about whether or not to decide whether they're going to be sending their manuscript to JCD or the Journal of Humanistic Counseling. Could you give some advice on how to decipher whether to send it to JCD or another journal?
Oh man, you're asking me to choose between my children here. Yeah. Okay. It depends on the author, where they're at in their career. It depends upon the audience you want to reach. And so I'll give some specifics. And again, I say this, and I literally have a tattoo of the cover of the Humanistic, Counseling Journal. So, JHC is great. I love JHC. There's a maximum number of terms you can have with JCD. I would love to, after my good friend Linwood Vereen decides to step down from JHC, I'd love to go back to JHC if I had the opportunity. So, but I'm also a realist. There's a small typical audience. There's 400 members of the Association of Humanistic Counseling, probably a quarter of which actually probably read the journal. Yes, there are people who seek out the journal, and that's not just most of our division journals are that way. So I don't want to suggest that it's a particularly small, diminutive audience. Like a lot of our division journals just have a smaller audience relative to JCD. So I think if you're a new author, that it just makes sense to look at, if you want to develop a career, to look at getting in the most widely read, widely cited journals early and often. You'll get the job you want, you'll get the tenure at the job you want, you'll get the readers you want. And again, that's not to suggest you can't, because the best pieces are not always accepted in JCD. Our division journals sometimes have just some of the most influential works that get cited more often. But if we do some Bayesian analysis here, like Bayesian statistical analysis, that happens, but that's less likely than at the flagship journal. So the pragmatist in me would suggest that. The more existentialist in me says, follow your heart place. Like, where is it you want things to be? Where do you want your name to be? What message do you want out there? And have integrity to that, and just submit to the journal that feels like the most congruence. But then there's other practical things you have to think about. Like if you do need published articles, I mean, JHC's actually acceptance rate is not that much different than ours. It's about 18%, if I remember correctly. But they just have fewer submissions. But I would probably say submit to JCD first, even knowing that even the best manuscripts sometimes won't get accepted. You're going to get great feedback, and then you can go to JHC after that.
Okay, before we open it up, there's one more question that came through. You mentioned longitudinal studies. How do you feel about studies with national longitudinal databases?
Oh, this is a good question. So I'm guessing that the question has to do with like secondary data. So the challenge with secondary data in counseling is, outside of its link towards assessment, it can be a challenge of showing how this is specifically informed by counseling intervention, right? This being said, you can make lots of really strong claims looking at longitudinal national data sets around assessment and other implications for possibly diagnosis, that would be my only caution, is that, we're not looking for cross-sectional studies, or with longitudinal studies, we're not looking for basically what a predictive, some type of regression analysis of like, that really essentially describes a population over time, right? We're looking at how that population evolves over time as a consequence of experience with mental health care, if that makes sense. And so, Julie, I think I saw that one come through on your chat. Did that answer what you meant by that question?
I guess I was thinking in terms of the research I do around schools and school counseling outcomes. So when you said how once you show how this would apply to counseling interventions, I was thinking in terms of school counseling.
Yeah, no, that fits really well. So when you're looking at national data sets on like student outcomes or client outcomes, the connection is very clear. The ones that I'm a little more cautious, and I'm trying to think of a good example here. So like some of the data sets you can purchase from, what's the name of the research center at University of Virginia? I just can't remember it off the top of my head. But, some of those that are just, that might have to do with like looking at depression over the course of time. We don't know if, from most of those data sets, there are some that do actually capture these data, but most of them don't capture like the amount of time in counseling, or even if they receive psychotherapeutic services. And so what you see in those data sets is just a generic population. So again, that lends really well for assessment, but that doesn't necessarily lend well to how counseling affected the individuals within that data set. Now, again, when you're talking about school counseling students over the course of time, yeah, I mean, that send those our way. I'd love those.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So now I'll open this up. Are there any questions or thoughts, or even recommendations? Like, how can we best help you all? Because I really do want this also to be an opportunity to give feedback, whether it be about this experience or whether it be about the review process. I think I just saw one come through. David, this is okay about pre-registered. So David, what I think you mean by this is there's now a trend that's starting to occur. Earlier, I talked about the replication crisis. Is this what you're referring to, where people are, yeah, okay. I see David shaking his head. There is a trend where people are putting their hypotheses, research questions out in advance. And what this does is that there's a belief that people will, in quantitative research, will less likely p-hack. P-hack's kind of the colloquial slang term for go back and data mine, go back and analyze 15 different ways until you finally find something of significance. I've thought about that because I do think it is a wise practice that certain journals are doing. I actually like, and I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but there's actually a depository, like a website that's been created where researchers are doing this, and it's all in a kind of central location where they're describing their a priori hypotheses, and then in those journals people will refer to that, right? That in their procedures. Julia just put it out. It's University of Michigan IS. Oh, and another text came in, so I got to open that back up. ISER, yeah, thank you. And that's kind of what I'm leaning towards. I think that makes sense because it's broadly accessible. Obviously, I just forgot the acronym, so I needed one of my smarter colleagues to remind me. But still, I could have easily searched for that. Oh, and Julia just put the link up inside of the chat for everyone. I think that's the best practice. I haven't decided if I want to start requiring that in the procedures. but it makes sense. I do know, and this is not hyperbole, I know for a fact that authors have p-hacked successful pieces in JCD. I know, not even speculatively, I just, in conversations, it's inadvertently come up, and it's like, oh man, okay, it's just not good practice, right? And I think that would minimize, it wouldn't completely alleviate p-hacking. That's a good question. Let me see. I think another one came through chat as well. Do I have any suggestions on getting a reader to review your work before submitting it? What are your thoughts on publishing dissertations in JCD? Okay, so on reader, well, so if you are working through the dissertation process, the nice thing is you have a committee who are your first set of readers, right? And so it's, obviously that's the first place I would go to, because if they're faculty members who are, conferring PhDs, hopefully they are still active scholars, or at least abreast of the literature and can help support that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea. We don't do pre-reviews. Like, I've been asked to do that at JCD. We just don't have the people power to review before we review, right? And also, I think it would create some inequity, right, for people who just submit. Publishing a dissertation, yeah, no, great. I mean, a great number of our studies, well, a great number, I'd say probably 10 to 20% of our accepted pieces will probably come in out of dissertation data. There's some guidance in the APA manual on how to work with your dissertation for publication. So I would suggest that any author who wants to take their dissertation into a published manuscript to look there, not just because it's not really suggestions on how to do it. It's more suggestions on, here's some best practices, like some ethics around it. Like, should you include your chair as an author, those types of things. So I just to encourage people to go there should they want to take their dissertation. But yeah, I don't think you shouldn't do a dissertation that does not later become at least one published journal article. So Dixie Myers also put forth in the chat another database where they archive under the National Health Registry. So thank you, Dixie, for that. And for folks that are just hearing that and this sounds Greek, it's worth the time on whatever search engine you use to look up the replication crisis, look up p-hacking. I mean, it's it certainly hasn't completely compromised academic scholarship, but it has definitely been a challenge to social science empirical work in the past 5 to 10 years. It's definitely worth your time to learn a little bit about that history and strategies so that you don't fall into those traps. Other thoughts, questions, reactions, suggestions?
Dr. Limburger-Truelove, there was one more question that came through via email about any potential. I think
that's the first time you've ever called me that, by the way.
I know, but I'm trying to be but if there any special issues or ideas you have coming up in the near future?
So okay, so we just went to copy editing a special issue on the multicultural social justice competencies. So that's done. There's in review now. The articles were due 3 days ago. Is this right? When it is today? This whole wobbly world, my sense of time is completely warped. So yeah, Lindsay said 5 days ago. So 5 days ago, a special issue on. So I've alluded to the 2010 special issue on research. We've wanted to update that, and so there will be in the last issue, I believe, or middle issue of this chronological year will be a update of that 2010 best practices in quantitative, qualitative, community-based research, social justice focused research. So basically a research focused special issue. I'm in conversations with someone I mean, I usually try to just wait until people have good ideas of special issues. There actually is a process for special issues. If you want to have a special issue, reach out to us and we can give you the information, the kind of protocol to follow. There's one I'm actually trying to recruit not trying to recruit, the person wants to do it. The person is a leading scholar in this area. And I just don't think that there's enough literature, which is just troubling to me given the nature of our profession, but preventative-based work. I'd love to see a special issue on that. And so that's possibly something that you all will see, the Royal you will see a call for manuscripts in the future. But those are the ones that there's at least been some conversation about to this point. And we haven't had any submissions for new ones outside of the special issue on research topics. Now, the review process for that is that they come to me and the senior associate editors, and then we, wrestle, and whoever wins, they get to decide, does that special issue, is it successful or not? No, we just, we all kind of, people offer their perspective, their review of the proposal for the special issue, and then we just make a decision. Usually I try to take a soft vote on those, but usually it's pretty clear what the senior associate editors have to say based upon the reviews. I think another chat came in. Let me. Yeah. This again a comment about the p hacking. I completely agree. We definitely need to hold ourselves. Like, I get the pressure to show the best side of your work, and yet, quantitative analyses in particular just require an a priori assumptions. We violate all the assumptions of pretty much every analysis plan if you don't have some a priori questions set forth. So, is this helpful? Okay. Are there things I'm leaving out, or things that would be more helpful, or things that you all would want to see from JCD moving forward?
A question just came through. Have we ever considered a fellows program in JCD?
The
Great question.
answer is no, but that's just more because no, it's not no that I wouldn't do it. It's no that I haven't thought about it. And now that I'm thinking about it, my first response is that it sounds cool. I need to think what that would actually mean. But yeah, if folks have ideas for that, like, definitely reach out to us, jcd@unt.edu, or email me directly. I like the idea of honoring the contributions of folks. And so any way that we can do that, it's a modest amount of effort relative to the outcome. Awarding some type of distinction generally is more fruitful than any amount of effort you can put into it. So I don't know what it would look like, but I like the idea of it just in principle. At this point, if you do have questions, I don't think you necessarily have to put them in the chat. You can probably just say it directly, or.
I was going to offer as well, if folks don't feel comfortable for whatever reason sharing, they can always email us at jcd@unt.edu. We check that email every day, so it does not go into a black hole, and we try to respond daily as well.
Matthew, I missed what you said about when we submit, what's what's the time that we would get a first response?
Yeah. So assuming it fits within the scope. So I do a cursory review because if it doesn't fit within the scope of JCD, I don't want it to sit in the full like 70 to 90 day review process. It's not terribly helpful. And I still will give some comments back, not as extensive as I will when they are gone through the full review process. And that's generally within 10 days, right? Me and Lindsay, I mean, 10 days or less on that. And so oftentimes a day, like within the day it's submitted, I'll get back pretty quick because I love this. This is fun. And those that get beyond the kind of just do they even marginally fit, and there's some I let through that I'm just like, if I'm kind of hedging, this fits the scope and this doesn't, I'll let the reviewers make that assessment. And so those excuse me, those go to the reviewers. They take anywhere from a couple of days to 30 days is what we give them, right? Am I right on that? We give them, is it 30 days? Yeah.
Yes, the reviewers each have 30 days. And
so the associate editors get between 15 and 30-ish days. Like we put 15 in the system. Again, is that right? Because I know we just changed this year.
Yeah, associate editors have 2 weeks to return their review to us.
And me, in the system I get a month. I don't think I've ever taken longer than a couple of days. That's not, maybe I think I had the flu once and I took a couple of weeks, or maybe 2 days. So our typical process is anywhere between 70 and 90 days. To publication, it's anywhere between let me see if I'm remembering this correctly. It's 11 and 14 months. And to put that in perspective, like talking with the Wiley folks, especially for a journal of this size, that's actually quite quick. That's quite quick. And I actually have deep pride in just how fast our review process, because I know what it's like being an author. So I want them good, but I also want them expedient. One just came through the chat. My expectations for brief reports. Okay, so this is a new area. I have to give credit to my predecessor, Rick Balkin, suggested that we added a brief reports. We've only published one so far. So brief reports really is designed for, especially like some type of intervention piece that you just couldn't, for whatever reasons, they're not poorly constructed studies, but there's certain concessions that you had to make that just, were reasonable to the study, but just somewhat, compromises the broader utility of the study. So like, for example, you could have a well-constructed intervention piece without a control group. There are some pretty robust designs without control groups. It probably is not, I'm really cautious in saying this because I've seen as many examples to contradict what I'm about to suggest as I've seen, those that support what I suggest. So I'm just very cautious in saying this, but if I had to choose between just a, randomized controlled trial with, delayed treatment and, some multi-level modeling where you're looking at effects of time, individual effects nested within time, nested within groups. I want to hear about every detail of that. If you had to make concessions because you're working in a prison, for example, and you just don't have access, or it's unethical, and yet it's still a really compelling story. Like the research still can inform practice and will be something that will be widely cited. It probably fits in the brief reports. And what I generally suggest, and this isn't something I necessarily put in the guidelines, for most pieces, just write it as a full 30-page manuscript, and we'll give you that feedback. That, you know, that some of the design features, we understand why you had to make these decisions, and they are something that should be mentioned in the limitations, but it probably is more fitting to a brief report. Does that make sense? All right, this next one. All right, this is more for everyone. I think it's important to highlight the JCD is intended for all divisions, all type of counseling. It's not just a CMH, clinical mental health counseling. Some comments in the conversation I get that couples and family and career, et cetera, should look elsewhere. Yeah, no, I hope I highlighted that point enough. We do represent, you know, we say formally in ACA 18 specialty areas, but I mean, we know better than that. I mean, there's as many specialties and subspecialties within counseling as there probably are counselors. And so we do represent that total body. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that I want, that great diversity. I don't want readers who are interested in something and never see anything that helps inform their practice. Like that'd be kind of an embarrassment to my tenure as editor. Just going to quickly check to see how many folks are still online. Oh, we still have 31 folks. That means I'm speculating that there's these questions that are just beneath the surface that either they're waiting for someone else to ask, or that you have and you're just waiting for the time. Now is the time. Can I repeat the other term you used referring to replication crisis? Yeah, well, so it's been called, there's actually a really great article out there. Let me see if I can link this really quick. Where the author talks about it not being a replication crisis so much as a generalization crisis. And it caused, in psychology in particular, quite a Twitter storm is what they've called. Let me see if I can post this real quick and not shut everything down. Give me just 1 second to see if I can find this for folks. See if I can find this article. I was just rereading this, and it's really a interesting read. Let me see if I can find, where is this guy? I'm one of those people who lives and dies by file folders and subfolders within Dropbox. And I had the best intentions of them helping me be able to pull up things quickly. And then I go back and I can't find which I put this in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to, oops, did I go off? All right, folks. Well, it's taking me a little longer to find this than I thought. Actually, you know what? I might have Mia try to Google this while I'm. So the author's name, I think it's Tanoni. If you real quickly Google like the generalization crisis. He's a research scholar at the University of Texas. I cannot remember what journal this was in. It's published in January, maybe December. And we'll post the link to that in the chat. It's just it does a great job of giving the history. Oh, it looks like someone found it. It just does a great job of describing the history and kind of offering some suggestions, some of which I'm surprised were published in a journal article, just because they were tongue in cheek, just how bad things are. But others of which are incredibly helpful on how to consider our work. And one of the recommendations was more descriptive studies, and which, I don't know. I haven't wrapped my mind completely around what I think about that for the purposes of JCD. But that particular author makes a very compelling argument. But yeah, it's the generalization crisis is the other term. And the basic idea is that even though we have certain assumptions in certain analytic processes that if you do things in such a way that that they're generalizable across different studies, if we're unable to replicate simply because we have certain tests that should substantiate such assumptions, is that necessarily true? Because we just don't seem to have evidence of it based upon what is and is not able to be replicated in the literature.
Dr. Brian found the link and posted it on the chat.
Thank you. And if anybody wants to see like academic squabble outside of CESNet, there truly was a quite a little thing in related to that article, like a pretty spirited debate about what it means. And like, I'm not necessarily endorsing the perspective of the author. I think it just does a good job of describing the history. So any more thoughts or questions or things that would be helpful or things that you think would help us?
Dr. Hunter had a question. Is there a process for submitting response articles?
Oh, that's good. No, I mean, it's the standard practice. Like, I think response articles would be great. There was the last one I can think of was under, actually, I think, so this one's coming from Quentin. Yeah. It was actually during, when I think you were an editorial assistant with Rick Balkin, was when Rocco Catoni responded to, can't remember the name of his first name, but last name was North, on radical social constructivism and the relevance for counseling. I think that's the last one I've seen. So no, I mean, there certainly is a place for that in JCD, but that was probably midway through Balkin's tenure. And so I'm 2 years in, so we're talking at least 5 years.
I have one more question here. You mentioned that process outcome research is something JCD is interested in. How about cross-cultural, cross-sectional research pieces pertaining to the impact of values and its impact on attitudes towards seeking counseling?
Okay. Yeah. So all the way, if the answer to the question, if it would have been the first 3 sentences, would have been, that's potentially informative, but probably not, JCD is probably not the best piece. But then that last bit makes it right within the wheelhouse of JCD, like the attitudes of relevance, like that would be the type of study I would love to see at JCD, for example. All right, folks. Well, I'll hang out for a few more minutes. And if any folks wanted to just off the larger room or session, wanted to ask some more direct questions, like, I'll stick around for a few minutes. And but otherwise, I just really appreciate the time that you all have invested in this. I really appreciate the work that you do. I appreciate just the commitment to JCD, and please, let your colleagues and friends know that these types of things will be something I'll do consistently, and hopefully, we can help people and they can help us produce a better product. So a question came through about supplemental material. This is a challenging one. This is actually one that hit me when I was an author, because I had all kinds of tables and descriptions about the intervention and because some of the things I do tend to be very layered. Like I do multi-level modeling coupled with, some quantitative and qualitative, but then my quantitative, growth models, I just can't fit it all in. And then they're related to interventions with children in difficult environments. And so I wanted to put a link to supplemental material in the last article that was accepted of mine before I could no longer submit my own pieces. And they cut that out. So there's not a way to do it right now in JCD that I'm aware of. I do know that some journals let you put a hyperlink in the text or something of that sort, or will have something tethered to the journalist, like it'll have its own kind of depository. Right now we don't have that, and it is something I'm thinking about, but right now the quick answer is that we just don't. We just have to fit it in the text.
You said earlier that, sort of an aside almost, that you weren't always too worried about outside perceptions or what people thought of you, which I can appreciate greatly. And in connection with articles that might be a bit not nationally politically in terms of red blue state kind of politics, but in terms of the politics of counseling and in the broader, wider field. Sometimes articles that might need a readership don't always get a readership in some circles because they're not considered orthodox, shall we say.
Yeah.
Oh, courageous to be here.
Well, it's a delicate thing,
It
right?
is.
Because
it really is.
Like all perspectives should be heard. Like to deplatform a perspective is counterpositions around diversity and justice and equity. And yet, intention is not always consistent with impact. And so even though I'm not, I've spent too many months in silent retreat worrying about myself that I don't have to worry about what others think of me at this point in my life. I do worry about how certain opinions affect others. And so like I do encourage controversy, but I don't encourage like being a provocateur for the sake of being a provocateur. Like JCD is not the appropriate place for that. And so some of these more challenging issues, if people present them in a way where they're balanced and are not intended to incite, offend, or compromise the integrity of the great diversity of different people who read JCD, you can have a position piece that is strong, persuasive, and yet responsive to that great diversity. So it sounds like I'm giving a delicate answer. It's not really that. It's just I want to make certain that like the nuance I'm articulating, right? So like, for example, what happened with ACA moving from in Tennessee a few years back was obviously a very controversial thing. And I know that the then editor received submissions related to that decision, right? I think it is, if they're well written, I think it's appropriate to have, maybe a scholarly conversation about what that means, right? For certain populations, right? But if I'm going to take some issues that are so challenging, then I probably will want to also seek out a very strong counterposition as well. Like I want it to be balanced. Like I don't want, one perspective to dominate another, such that, in amplifying the voice of one population of our readership, that we're minimizing another. Does that help, Lori? I think another question.
It does. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Although in the specific situation I'm thinking about, the counterposition would already have a megaphone, whereas this is David and Goliath-ish, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I mean, that's a challenge, right? Is I think that even though it's out there, the prevailing position, there's a way to describe it without pandering to it if you're trying to challenge it.
Yeah.
And that would be my suggestion.
Yeah.
Yep.
What you said before too, quality, not offensive, not inciting, no, but making a strong case for something. So
yeah. And that's what I alluded to before when I said there's a difference between conceptual and theory pieces. Theory pieces have a strong thesis, and theory pieces are kind of analogous to good empirical pieces. Empirical pieces have a research question and have evidence to support that. Have a clear thesis, and also seek out the opportunity for counterfactuals, like opposite evidence, right? And could do that. And so, like a position piece is a theoretical, like you're promulgating a theoretical position. A strong one should at least, again, kind of apprehend both sides in a way that makes it compelling, because the reader knows that you've considered both sides.
Yeah. I've been working with a team from across the country in a writing group, and we've got a manuscript that it kind of falls between the practice and the theory guidelines a little bit, because it's aimed at training and supervision practice. It's aimed at practitioners, but it also has implications even for public policy or counseling practice, supervision practice. And we are saying stuff that would be, it's a call to make some changes in supervision in particular. Yeah, I don't know how much to say. So,
yeah,
but it kind of falls in the crack a little bit between those two. It's not,
well,
yeah.
No, I appreciate that, and also know that I'm pretty sympathetic to, while I'm sympathetic to protecting the stability of our profession and our practitioners so that they can have a career into the future. I have 2 doctoral students on the line now who will certainly tell you I hold my own bleeding edge positions, especially around the issues of, like, for example, I don't think that, any controversy around this one's going to get me in too much trouble. And again, not that I would care, but like continuing education, we've got no evidence for a $1 billion industry that it actually improves practice, and the decisions around continuing education are made by the people with the greatest amount of power in our profession. And that's not to suggest that we shouldn't have continuing education. And yet I do think we should relook at the amount and the quality and what that actually means. How does it contribute to client outcomes? I would love to see a study of, like theory, maybe to a lesser degree, because I just don't know if that would change people's minds, because I think the biases are so strong. But an empirical study looking at how and what quality of continuing education changes client outcomes, or even counseling practice. And yet we have policy that are, again, just ubiquitous across states, expensive to our least economically entitled people in our profession, like our people who are just graduating with $70,000 in student loans, making $30,000, are having to commit to practices that we don't have really good, strong evidence changes outcomes. In fact, another controversial one that for the folks online, and I can point to this one. This is a study. I had my doc students read this one. Years of practice does not seem to contribute to client outcomes. In fact, there's a statistically insignificant, I've seen David shaking his head, like he's probably read this one, it's a Bruce Wimpole piece. There's a statistically, it's marginally significant inverse relationship. So in other words, the more you practice, client outcomes actually don't get better, they get worse. And again, that's just one study, but they actually cite a number of other studies, but that's just one of the more recent. And that would be incredibly controversial. And I would love to have been the one to publish that one.
All right. Well, our team is planning on making a submission, so keep your eyes open, and we'll see where that goes. And Colette's been in on it at times and earlier in the process, and then as a kind of a closer for giving us are we ready to roll and so forth. So anyways, thank you so very much for the time today. It's really nice, it was helpful, and appreciate the work you do for JCD too. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for attending.
You bet.
I think another question came in. I'm going to make certain I hit this one while chat. In the process of turning my dissertation into a manuscript, I focused on the experiences of women of color in counseling doctoral programs at predominantly white institutions. I used 4 scales and also offered space for open-ended responses. Into a manuscript. Oh yeah, this is one of those challenging ones about just too much data for 30 pages. Because, you know, I think I alluded to this in my own research. I do multi-method, so both quant and qual, and my quantitative analyses are multi-level modeling, which typically the procedure section are almost 7 or 8 pages themselves. And so, you know, I earlier I talked about holding steadfast to 30 pages, and yet I have to acknowledge, because at least 1 or 2 people who are on this line now were involved in this. Like when I submitted some of my most recent accepted pieces in JCD, the then editor took them even though they were 50 pages. This is one of those, it depends, and I don't like the ambiguity of this because it doesn't set a good precedent, but you know, I would rather not be rigid. There are just some manuscripts you just can't cut down because the design. So like, if this is one where the quantitative, like, so for example, a sequential analysis is atop the multi-method approach where the quant builds off of the initial qual and you're constantly going back and forth. If it's that type of study, you shouldn't pull them apart. It's actually kind of unethical to pull them apart because one set of data, the quantitative data, was reliant upon the preceding qualitative data. Those are very rare studies. Usually people pull apart their studies and look at, you know, ways to maximize the number of publications from one data set. Without knowing this particular study, I can't give a really strong recommendation. I don't privilege quantitative or qualitative. I just privilege well-designed studies. And so for the purposes of submitting to JCD, I would suggest if you have to pull apart because it's just too much, and you know, I would say what design do you have the most faith in and that tells the best story, and err on the side of going with that one for your first submission to JCD. You could also then, you know, use the other data for a second article, you know, or a second submission. But if they have to go together, if the design is just so reliant upon each other, then reach out to me and you know, we'll try to make a decision. But more likely than not, you know, it gets desk rejected with an encouragement to cut it down to 30 pages and submit again. Let's see if I have any others here, any that I've missed. Yeah, I know you're watching these. Are there any that I've missed?
No, I think you've covered all of that have come in, and including those on email.
Well, are there any, I want to give people a last opportunity if there's any other questions or thoughts or comments.
Someone was interested in reviewing for JCD, what would you suggest they do? What kind of qualifications are you looking for?
That's a good one. I should have planted that.
Yeah.
We do have a process of reviewing reviewers, and we ask, we send it out to Counseling Today, some of the listservs. I'm trying to think where else we send it out to. There's a few other places. Generally, what we look for is, have you successfully published in the past yourself? And have you served on other review boards? If you've successfully done both of those, more than likely you'll be picked up as a reviewer if we have space. So then how to become a reviewer for JCD? Get on a division review board for at least a term, publish. If you've published in JCD, that's even extra little boon. But honestly, like, you know, it's harder to find good reviewers than I would like to admit. Like, it's just, let me rephrase that. All of our reviewers are great. It's just, I could never have enough really good reviewers, is what I mean. And I get that, you know, people are busy, but if you've shown a commitment to your own scholarship and serving on other boards, it's a pretty good predictor that you'll do that with JCD.
And the call for reviewers will be coming out. You should see it in the April and May Counseling and Counseling Today newsletter. So it'll give specific instructions on what to send to jcd@unt.edu.
Great, thank you.
All right, folks. Well, have a happy Friday. I mean, this is some precarious times indeed. But, you know, one of the things I actually thought about, and I know there's not as many people on the horn as were before, but one of the things I had thought about starting off with, but then I decided not to because I just didn't want to take up that much time. But just this idea that in the midst of social distancing, there was kind of, I think, some cognitive dissonance on the front end, because so many folks will say, I wish I just had more time just to be at home, you know, just to be with my family and not have to work or not have to go out and do things. And yet we don't prepare. That's a skill, like being with your own thoughts, being the people in your life in a confined space is just don't practice that skill enough of how to be with our own sense of self. And so you know, obviously I think as someone who's interested in mindfulness-based work, that's one way of doing it. But the other way is to know when you have opportunities to convene with others, like-minded individuals, how to maximize those rare and important opportunities. And so I just greatly appreciate that everyone has taken this time to share their time, their valuable time with us and with JCD. Cool. All right, well, be well.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you, man.